Good day, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on exfoliative cytology. Today, we are going to dive into a very important area in histopath and laboratory science. The study of cells that are shed from body surfaces and how we examine them for diagnostic purposes. Exfoliative cytology is a cornerstone technique in clinical laboratory medicine. So by the end of today's session, you should be able to define cytology, distinguish different techniques used in exfoliative cytology, and explain what happens from the moment a cytologic sample is collected to when it is evaluated. So let us get started. Before we begin our discussion, let us first orient ourselves with what we are expected to learn by the end of this lecture. Our three learning outcomes are first, to define cytology, second, to distinguish the several techniques used in exfoliative cytology, and third, to explain the procedures involved when receiving cytologic samples. Let us now address the first learning outcome, defining cytology and its related terms. We have three key definitions here, and it is crucial that you distinguish them from one another because they are often tested. First, cytology. Cytology in the histopathology context is the study of the histology of exfoliated, abraded, or desquamated cells. Simply put, it is the microscopic examination of individual cells. So as opposed to histology, which examines tissues, the word cytology comes from the Greek word skytos, meaning cell, and logos, meaning study. Second, imprint or abraded cytology. This technique involves studying cells that are directly taken from the surfaces of excised or surgical specimens by simply touching or pressing those specimens onto a clean glass slide. You are literally making a stamp or imprint of the tissue. This is very useful intraoperatively because you get results quickly. Third, and this is the main focus of our lecture today, exfoliative cytology. This is the microscopic study of desquamated cells, cells that have naturally shed or have been physically removed from epithelial surfaces. The word exfoliate literally means to shed or peel off. Think of skin cells that naturally slough off. That same principle applies here, but to internal epithelial linings such as the cervix, lungs, stomach, and so on. Now that we know what exfoliative cytology is, let us discuss why we do it. What are the clinical purposes of this technique? Number one, assessing cancerous conditions. That is, staging of cancer. Once a cancer is diagnosed, cytology helps us determine how advanced it is. Is it still localized? Has it spread? That information is critical for treatment planning. Number two, detection of asymptomatic cancers. This is perhaps the most powerful application of exfoliative cytology. We can detect cancer even before the patient shows any symptoms. The classic example is the Papa Nicolau smear, or the Pap smear, which has dramatically reduced deaths from cervical cancer precisely because it catches abnormalities early. Number three, assessment of female hormonal activity. Exfoliative cytology can be used to evaluate sterility and endocrine disorders through something called the maturity index, which we will discuss later. The ratio of different cell types in a vaginal smear reflects hormonal status. Number four, determination of genetic sex using Barr bodies. A Barr body is a conglomeration of chromatin formed from the inactivated X chromosome in cells with two or more X chromosomes. In females who have XX chromosomes, you will see a Barr body in the nuclei. This was historically used in genetic sex determination. And number five, detection of possible infection. Cytology can reveal the presence of microorganisms or characteristic cellular changes associated with infections. For example, Trichomonas vaginalis, Candida species, or herpes virus inclusions. Now that we understand the why, let us talk about the how. How do we prepare cytologic material for examination? There are two broad approaches, preparing smears or preparing tissue blocks, also known as cell blocks. The choice between smears and cell blocks depends on the type and amount of specimen you have. Smears are faster and simpler. Cell blocks, on the other hand, allow for sectioning and additional staining. They are more similar to histological processing. Now, let us look at the various regions from which cytologic specimens can be collected. These include the vaginal smear, perhaps the most well-known, endometrial and endocervical smears, prostatic and breast secretions, gastric or bronchial secretions, pleural or peritoneal fluids, sputum, smears of urine sediment, and cerebrospinal fluid. Each of these specimen types has unique collection methods, processing steps, and clinical indications, and we will go through them one by one in the next several slides. Keep this list in mind as a big picture overview of the scope of exfoliative cytology. Let us now get into the technical details of smear preparation. These steps are critical. Errors in preparation can render a sample uninterpretable, leading to false negatives or diagnostic failures. So pay attention. So, step 1, always make smears from fresh and moist material. Do not let the specimen dry before smearing. Apply it on a clean glass slide and critically do not create clumps. So clump cells obscure nuclear details, which is what we rely on for cytologic diagnosis. Next, you can use a diamond pen to inscribe patient identifiers directly on the glass, such as name, age, date, and type of smear. Alternatively, you may use frosted end slides where you can write with a pencil. This step is non-negotiable for patient safety and specimen integrity. Next, for step 3 is fixation. This is perhaps the most time-sensitive step. You open the fixative container beforehand, then immerse the smear immediately using a single uninterrupted motion. Why? Because exfoliated cells decompose rapidly. Any delay leads to air drying artifacts, a very common cause of unsatisfactory specimens. If using spray fixative, hold the can at least 12 inches, that is 1 foot away from the slide. Spraying too close can blow the cells off the slide or distort them. Next step, you need to avoid vibrations in the fixative container, which can dislodge the cells from the slide. And lastly, allow optimal fixation time of 1 hour. This allows adequate dehydration, adhesion of cells to the slide, and maximal penetration of the fixative. Continuing our discussion on smear preparation, let us now focus on fixatives, which one to use and when. The best fixative for cytologic smears is 95% ethanol ether. It gives excellent fixation and produces sharp nuclear detail. However, there is a significant caveat. It is highly flammable, so while it is superior in quality, it requires careful handling and proper storage away from open flames. The routinely used fixative in most laboratories is 95% ethanol or ethanol alone without the ether. So it is safe, effective, and widely available. Now, what happens if smears cannot be made immediately? You would place the collected material in 50% alcohol as a temporary preservative for all types of effusions. So this has since been largely replaced by Saccomano's preservative, which contains two components, 50% ethanol and 2% carbowax. Carbowax, also known as polyethylene glycol, acts as a cell coat that prevents drying artifacts during transportation. For storage, add alcohol and refrigerate. So the concentration depends on the specimen type, 50% alcohol for pleural and peritoneal effusions, 70% alcohol for sputum, and 95% alcohol for urine, bronchial, and gastric specimens. The higher the cellular fragility or the more proteinaceous the fluid, the more dilute the fixative to avoid overshrinkage. Now, let us address some special situations you may encounter in smear preparation. First, mailed specimens. If a specimen is going to be mailed to a referral laboratory, the proper procedure is to fix it for 2 hours. First, then air dry it for 10 to 15 minutes, and then place it in a protective container. This ensures the fixation is complete before transport, and air drying reduces the risk of damage during shipping. Second, we have large volume specimens. If the specimen is more than just a few drops, for example, a large volume of pleural or peritoneal fluid, do not attempt to smear it directly. Instead, centrifuge the specimen at 2000 rpm for 2 minutes. After centrifugation, decant, that means carefully pour off the supernatant. Then, smear the sediment directly onto a glass slide. Alternatively, you can use a cytocentrifuge, which deposits the cells directly onto the slide with albumin as an adhesive. Any excess sediment that cannot be smeared can be used for the cell block technique, an excellent way to make the most out of limited specimens. Cell blocks allow you to create histologic sections from cytologic material, giving you both cytologic and quasi-histologic information. Now let us talk about how we process specimens based on their physical characteristics. Different specimen consistencies require different pre-analytical steps. There are 4 main categories. First, viscous specimens. These include cervical, vaginal, and prostatic secretions. Because they are thick, they should be immersed in ether ethanol as soon as possible to begin fixation and to thin out the material for better smear quality. Second, we have mucoid specimens. These include sputum, bronchial secretions, and gastric secretions. The key point here is that before fixing the smear, you must dry the smear edges first. Why? Because if you immerse a mucoid smear in fixative without drying the edges first, the mucus will run off the slide due to the liquid fixative. You will lose your specimen. So, always dry the edges first to create a barrier, then fix. Third, we have bloody specimens. So the problem with bloody specimens is that the large number of red blood cells obscures the cells of interest. So the solution is to lyse the red blood cells by adding 2 to 5 ml of concentrated acetic acid per 100 ml of the specimen. So acetic acid is a red cell lysing agent and does not significantly damage the nucleated cells we want to examine. Fourth, we have watery specimens. These include urine, exudates, and aspirates. Because they are dilute, you need to concentrate them first. Centrifuge the specimen and smear the sediment on an albumin-coated glass slide. The albumin acts as an adhesive, helping the cells stick to the glass. If there is a large amount of sediment, you may subject this excess to biopsy. Let us now talk about adhesion. That is, making sure the cells stick to the glass slide and stay there throughout processing and staining. Without adequate adhesion, cells will wash off during staining, leaving you with an empty slide. Now, you might wonder, why not just use albumin for everything? Well, albumin is not recommended for specimens that will be stained with Papa Nicolau stain because albumin retains the orange-green or the OG component of the pap stain, leading to background staining that can obscure cellular detail. So, which specimens actually require adhesives? 3 main categories: urinary sediment, bronchoalveolar lavage or the BAL, and specimens containing proteolytic enzymes like your saliva, which actively degrade uh, the proteins that would normally help cells adhere. Concentrated sputum is also in this group. What makes a good adhesive? It must be permeable, meaning the fixative and stain must be able to pass through it to reach the cells. It should not interfere with staining. Examples of good adhesives include pooled serum or plasma, a readily available biological adhesive. You have celluloidine ether alcohol, a thin film-forming solution, and leuconostoc culture, a polysaccharide-producing bacterial culture used to create a mucilaginous adhesive layer. So, why does saliva require an adhesive? It's because these proteolytic enzymes break down the protein matrix that holds the cells to the slide. So you need an exogenous adhesive to compensate. So that's why. Now we come to the classification of cytologic specimens. So we divide them into two major categories, non-gynecologic specimens and gynecologic specimens. This distinction is important not just academically, but practically. The collection methods, the clinical indications, the processing steps, and the interpretation criteria differ significantly between the two groups. So we will examine each category in detail over the next several slides. So let us start with the non-gynecologic specimens. Non-gynecologic specimens include a wide range of body fluids and secretions from various organ systems. Let me give you the complete list. So we have respiratory specimens, gastrointestinal specimens, peritoneal and pleural and pericardial smears, urine, breast secretion, cerebrospinal fluid, and prostatic secretion. So we will go through each of these systematically. Each has its own collection method, processing requirements, and clinical significance. Are you ready? Let us now begin with the respiratory system. Respiratory specimens are collected from the lungs and airways and are primarily used for the detection of pulmonary malignancies, infections, and inflammatory conditions. So there are four main types. So we have sputum, bronchial brushing, bronchoalveolar lavage or the BAL, and the bronchial aspirate. Each of these has different levels of sensitivity and is used in different clinical contexts. So let us go through them one by one. Sputum is the most accessible of the respiratory specimens. No invasive procedure is required. It can demonstrate abnormal cells early in the disease process, even before the patient develops symptoms. This is its great advantage. The ideal sputum specimen is fresh, unfixed, and ideally collected on at least 3 consecutive early morning occasions. Why consecutive? Because sensitivity increases with multiple samples. A single sputum sample may miss cells. Why early morning? Because overnight secretions accumulate in the lungs and airways, producing a more concentrated and representative specimen. One specimen is reserved for GEMSA staining, and two are reserved for PAP staining. So this gives both morphological overview and as well as nuclear detail. For patients unable to produce sputum spontaneously, such as those with chronic obstructive disease, induced sputum is an option. The patient inhales an aerosol solution for 20 minutes to stimulate expectoration. However, a word of caution, this procedure can trigger bronchospasm, so it should be used carefully in asthmatic patients. For the collection vessel, it should be a wide-mouth bottle containing Saccharomyces fluid, which acts as a preservative. After collection, pour the specimen into a Petri dish and look for solid or blood-flecked particles. So these particles are where the cells of interest are most concentrated. Remove them, place them on a slide, crush gently with another slide to spread evenly, and fix for at least 1 hour. Here is a critical quality control point. If you examine the smear and see no histiocytes or alveolar macrophages, this is a red flag, because their absence indicates that only saliva was collected, not through sputum from the lower respiratory tract. Such a specimen is inadequate and should be rejected and recollected. Again, our quality indicator here, if there are no macrophages, this is saliva only. So you need to reject the specimen. Moving on to bronchial brushing. This technique uses a small brush passed through a bronchoscope to directly scrape cells from the bronchial mucosa. Because the brush directly contacts the epithelium, the specimen is more concentrated than the sputum and contains more representative cells. It is particularly useful for detecting cells from advanced malignancies, tumors that are accessible to the bronchoscope. So the smear technique used for bronchial brushings is the pull-apart technique. Two slides are pressed together with a specimen between them, then pulled apart quickly to create two thin, even smears simultaneously. Critically, you need to fix it immediately. There's no time to waste. Even brief air exposure creates air drying artifacts that can seriously distort nuclear morphology, potentially mimicking malignant changes. Now, for bronchoalveolar lavage or BAL, sometimes called bronchial washing. So this technique involves instilling saline into the distal airways and then recovering it. It washes out cells from the alveolar spaces. BAL has a very specific and important clinical indication. It is performed in patients with AIDS to rule out Pneumocystis jirovecii infection, formerly called Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia or PCP. This opportunistic fungal infection is a major cause of death in immunocompromised patients, and BAL cytology is one of the key diagnostic methods. So I have a question, my dear students. Why would AIDS patients be specifically tested for Pneumocystis jirovecii? It's because this reinforces the connection between immunosuppression and opportunistic infections, which is a very, very important concept in clinical laboratory science. Next, we have bronchial aspirates. Bronchial aspirates are collected by either aspiration using a glass suction apparatus or by washing with saline. This technique is best for showing evidence of malignancy in advanced stage disease when the tumor is large enough to shed cells into the airways. So as for the processing, you need to centrifuge the specimen for 20 to 30 minutes at medium speed. This concentrates the cells in the sediment, which is then smeared. So a good bronchial aspirate smear should contain epithelial cells, specifically ciliated bronchial cells, which confirm the specimen is from the lower airways, as well as red blood cells and white blood cells. The presence of ciliated cells is a quality indicator. So if the specimen is very scanty, prepare the smear in the operating room or at the point of collection to prevent drying. Do not wait until you get to the laboratory. Next, we have gastrointestinal specimens. Gastrointestinal cytology is used primarily for the diagnosis of malignant tumors of the GI tract. The main techniques include gastric lavage, gastric brushing, and fine needle aspiration or FNA of submucosal lesions. Collection method, you can use irrigation and aspiration. So the stomach is irrigated with fluid, and then the fluid now containing shed cells is aspirated and collected. So why is GI cytology difficult? So we have two reasons. First, the inaccessibility of certain regions of the GI tract, and second, the presence of gastric fluid, which contains hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes that can rapidly destroy cells. This is why specimens must be examined as soon as possible. So patient preparation is essential. The patient must fast for at least 8 hours before the procedure, and even water is prohibited. So any food or drink would dilute the specimen and contaminate it with food particles. So there are two collection methods named after their originators. So we have the Levine method, use a nasogastric tube inserted through the nose into the stomach for collection. So the Rifus method uses a tube inserted through the mouth. So the choice depends on the patient comfort and clinical preference. Next, we have peritoneal, pleural, and pericardial smears. So these cavity fluids, peritoneal, pleural, and pericardial, are collected by aspiration using the same general technique as bronchial specimens. So under normal circumstances, these cavities contain only a small amount of fluid. If fluid increases significantly, a condition called effusion, it usually signals a pathologic process. So the fluid is examined both biochemically and cytologically. The presence of malignant cells in these fluids usually indicates metastatic disease, cancer that has spread from a distant primary site and seeded the body cavity. For example, ovarian cancer frequently seeds the peritoneal cavity, and lung cancer often causes malignant pleural effusions. So an important technical detail, you can add 300 units of heparin per 100 ml of aspirate to prevent clotting. So these fluids contain fibrinogen and clotting factors. So if the specimen clots, you lose cells trapped in the clot, and you cannot make a good smear because heparin prevents this. Next, we have urine. Urine cytology is used for the detection of malignancy of urothelial origin, that is, cancer arising from the urothelium, the transitional epithelium lining the urethra, bladder, ureters, renal pelvis, and some other organs. So it is not used for diagnosing prostatic carcinomas. Collection methods differ by sex, so in males, the second voided urine is preferred. Why not the first morning void? Because cells that have spent extended time in the acidic environment of the bladder tend to degenerate. So their nuclei become pycnotic and their cytoplasm liquefies, making them uninterpretable. So the second void, which comes after the patient has been up and moving, is fresher. So in females, catheterized urine is used because voided specimens in females are frequently contaminated with vaginal cells and microorganisms, so which interfere with interpretation. So the volume, at least 50 ml, is needed to ensure adequate cellularity after centrifugation. So for more reliable evaluation, urine may be collected and examined twice, once in the early morning and once later in the day. So multiple specimens increase diagnostic sensitivity. So the use of preservatives is generally not recommended for urine cytology as they can distort cellular morphology. Next, we have breast secretion. Breast secretion cytology involves examining spontaneous nipple discharge. Collection is simple. Use a cotton swab or touch prep to sample the discharge directly from the nipple. So breast secretion cytology is used primarily for hormonal imbalance testing and for evaluating benign breast lesions or endocrine problems. An important limitation to understand is that breast secretion cytology has an extremely low diagnostic yield for breast carcinoma. It is not a reliable screening tool for breast cancer, so this is a major contrast with cervical cytology, which is an effective cancer screening tool. So one clinically useful pearl. So if the nipple discharge is bloody, it most commonly indicates benign intraductal papilloma, which is a benign growth within the milk ducts. So while this should still be evaluated, a bloody discharge does not automatically mean cancer. Next, we have cerebrospinal fluid or the CSF. So cerebrospinal fluid cytology is a specialized technique used to detect cells in the CSF, which is obtained by lumbar puncture. The key requirement here is the volume, which has a minimum of 1 ml of CSF is necessary to have enough cells for examination. CSF is normally acellular or contains only a very small number of lymphocytes. The presence of malignant cells, such as in lymphomeningeal carcinomatosis or infectious organisms in the CSF, is a serious finding with significant clinical implications. So, CSF must be processed immediately upon collection because cells degenerate rapidly in this protein-poor environment. Next, we have prostatic secretion. Prostatic secretion cytology involves collecting 3 specimens in a specific sequence. First, voided urine before prostatic massage. Second, a smear of prostatic secretion obtained by massage. And third, urine collected after massage. So why this sequence? Prostatic massage by the clinician physically expresses fluid from the prostate gland into the urethra, where it can be collected. So the urine before massage serves as the baseline. So the secretion during massage is the primary specimen, and the urine after massage captures any remaining cells flushed out. So the recommended specimen for cytologic examination is the third specimen. So the urine after unproductive massage. Unproductive means the massage did not yield a visible secretion directly, so the cells are then found in the post-massage urine. So the specimen is considered most representative. We now shift to gynecologic cytology, specifically vaginal and cervical smears. This is arguably the most clinically impactful area of exfoliative cytology. Vaginal and cervical smears serve as a screening test for precancerous conditions of the cervix. Critically, they are not diagnostic on their own, so a positive smear requires histologic confirmation through biopsy before a definitive diagnosis of malignancy is made. So the anatomically critical area is the transformation zone or the T-zone, which is the junction between the endocervical columnar mucosa and the ectocervical squamous epithelium. This is the area most vulnerable to dysplasia and cervical cancer development. All collection efforts should target this zone. So, as for the collection method, aspiration of the posterior fornix or the posterior recess of the vagina, or swabbing of the cervix. So, instruments include an 8-inch glass pipette with rubber bulb used specifically for cancer cytology. So, the sterile wooden tongue depressor used for hormonal studies. The Ayer's spatula, a wooden or plastic spatula shaped to fit the contour of the cervix, and the cervix brush, which samples both the ectocervix and the endocervix simultaneously. So, may I ask, why is the transformation zone the most important area to sample? This is because this is where the metaplastic cells that are most vulnerable to HPV transformation are found. So, understanding the biology reinforces the rationale for the collection technique. So, several important precautions must be observed to ensure the validity of a vaginal smear. So, these are both patient-related and technique-related. So, the patient must avoid vaginal examination and douching for 24 to 48 hours before collection. Douching washes away surface cells and can disturb the flora, while a vaginal examination can cause cellular trauma and bleeding that confounds interpretation. So, as for the smearing technique, you can spread the smear thinly using a rotary motion, then fix smear strap cells in layers, preventing adequate fixation and staining penetration. So, as for the equipment, you can use a glass pipette. It should be absolutely dry because water is the enemy of cytologic preparations. So even a small amount of residual water, it can distort the cell detail by causing osmotic swelling or lysis of the cells. So no lubricant or powder should be used. Lubricants commonly used in pelvic examination, such as the KY jelly, it can contain substances that coat cells and interfere with staining. So powder introduces foreign particulate matter that can be confused with organisms or cellular debris. Let us now look at the specific collection techniques and their indications. So for endocervical brush, it is used to sample the endocervical canal. Specifically, it is designed to reach cells higher up in the cervical OS, so which are not accessible with the Ayer's spatula alone. For vaginal scrape, it is used in patients who have undergone hysterectomy. Since there is no cervix, the sampling is done from the vaginal vault. So when we talk about hysterectomy, it's a surgical procedure to remove the womb or the uterus. So for the lateral vaginal scrape, performed specifically for hormonal evaluation, so the upper lateral third of the vaginal wall is sampled because it has the least contamination from cervical secretions and it's the most hormonally responsive. Next, for four-quadrant vaginal scrape, so performed for the localization of vaginal adenosis. It is a condition where your glandular cells appear in the vaginal wall where they do not normally belong. So sampling all four quadrants ensures comprehensive coverage. For the vulvar scrape, it is used for the detection of herpetic lesions or vulvar carcinoma. So the cells are scraped directly from the vulvar surface. We now arrive at one of the most important topics in cytology, the Papa-Nicolau staining method, universally known as the Pap stain. This is the staining method of choice for cytologic preparations. So the Pap stain was developed by Dr. George Papa-Nicolau in the 1940s, originally for the detection of uterine and cervical cancers. It has since been applied to cytologic evaluation of virtually all types of secretions and body fluids. What makes the pop stain special? There are four key qualities. First, it produces transparent blue staining of the cytoplasm, which preserves clarity and allows cells below to be seen. Second, it produces excellent nuclear detail. So this is critical because nuclear characteristics are the primary basis for distinguishing benign from malignant cells. Third, the color range is predictable, meaning you can reliably interpret what you see without ambiguity. Fourth, It is valuable for comparing cellular appearances across different smear types and disease states. So again, Dr. Papanicolaou's contribution has been credited with reducing cervical cancer mortality by over 70% in countries with organized screening programs. So I hope that you will appreciate the real-world impact of our profession. The PAP stain uses three distinct staining components, so each targeting different cellular structures. First, hematoxylin. This is the nuclear stain, so it stains nuclei a blue-purple color, revealing chromatin pattern, the nuclear size, nuclear envelope irregularities, and presence of nucleoli, all key criteria for cytologic diagnosis. Second, we have the OG6 or the orange-green 6. This is a cytoplasmic stain that selectively stains the cytoplasm of mature keratinized cells. That is, squamous cells that have undergone full maturation and differentiation. So it stains them orange. Third, we have Eosin azure, also known as the EA stain. This is a polychromatic stain that targets immature or non-keratinized cytoplasm. It is actually a mixture of several components. So we have eosin, which colors pink, phosphotanglic acid or the PTA, which serves as the mordant, light green stain, which comes in concentrations. We have 36, 50, or 65, then the lithium carbonate, which is an alkalinizing agent, and as well as Bismarck brown. Together, these three stains produce a full color spectrum like blue to purple nuclei, orange mature cytoplasm, and green to blue immature cytoplasm. So this multicolor output allows cytologists to rapidly assess cell type, maturity, and abnormality at a glance. The modified Papanicolaou method is a slight variation of the original PAP stain. The key modification is the omission of the Bismarck brown dye from the EA solution. What is the effect of this modification? The result is improved sharpness of color and more brilliant staining reactions overall. Bismarck brown has a muddy, brownish tone that can dull the clarity of other stain components. So by removing it, you get crisper, more vivid colors that are easier to interpret. So the modified method is now more commonly used than the original, so particularly in modern cytopathology laboratories. So when you see PAP stain mentioned in the clinical practice today, so it usually refers to the modified version. So again, for the modified, you have omitted the Bismarck brown, which will be resulting into better colors. Vaginal hormonal cytology is a technique that uses the cellular composition of vaginal smears to assess a woman's hormonal status. It is inexpensive and non-invasive, and it can be performed regularly even in pregnant women without undue risk. So before collection, the patient must abstain from vaginal examination or douching for at least 24 hours. The specimen is taken from the upper lateral third of the vaginal wall. So a location that is less prone to contamination, more accessible, and most responsive to hormonal changes. So an important instrument-specific note that I can give you here is the wooden spatula. So it is recommended only for vaginal hormonal studies. So for all other purposes, other collection instruments should be used. For microscopic examination, it follows a two-step approach. So at low power objective or the LPO, you as the examiner will first assess overall smear and staining quality. You can detect any RBCs or WBCs, identifies the type of exfoliated cells present, and makes a rough assessment of cell proportions. So at high power objective or the HPO, the cells are quantified precisely, which is necessary for calculating hormonal indices. In a cervicovaginal smear, you will encounter several distinct cell types. So each reflects a different level of epithelial maturation and has a different hormonal association. We have 7 main cell types to discuss. So these are mature superficial cells, intermediate cells, parabasal cells, basal cells, endometrial cells, endocervical glandular cells, and Dudderlane bacilli. So let us go through each one in the next several slides. So pay close attention to the distinguishing features of each cell type. These are commonly uh, board exam questions or our upcoming term exam question. Okay. First, we have mature superficial cells. So mature superficial cells are the most differentiated cells in the vaginal epithelium. Morphologically, they are polygonal in shape with pale pink cytoplasm and dark pycnotic nuclei. So the nucleus is less than 6 micrometers in diameter. So these cells are abundant during the proliferating phase, so the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. So when estrogen levels are high, their presence reflects estrogen stimulation. So estrogen promotes full squamous maturation, and these cells represent the end product of that maturation. So they show true acidophilia, meaning the pink color is genuine due to keratin production stimulated by estrogen, so resulting in intracellular keratin that binds to the orange to pink stains. However, there is also a condition called pseudoacidophilia or false pink staining, which can occur in several situations. So we have vaginal prolapse and drying or drying of smears before fixation, infection, and exposure to chemicals. So these conditions can make immature cells look artificially pink, leading to misinterpretation. So you need to always correlate with the clinical context. So next we have the intermediate cells. Intermediate cells are medium-sized polyhedral or elongated cells with basophilic blue staining cytoplasm that may contain vacuoles. So they are abundant during the secretory phase of the menstrual cycle, which occurs from day 14 to day 28 under the influence of progesterone. So within the intermediate cell category, there are two special subtypes deserve attention. First, the navicular cells. So these are boat-shaped cells with folds or curls on their edges, so like the hull of a boat. So they appear as a result of combined estrogen-progesterone effect and are characteristically seen during the latter half of the menstrual cycle, during pregnancy and during menopause. So second, we have your pregnancy cells. So these are round to oval cells with a distinctive translucent basophilic cytoplasm at the center of the cell. So the translucency is caused by central glycogen accumulation. So the glycogen displaces the cytoplasm and creates a clear central zone. So the nucleus is eccentric, so pushed to the one side, and they have a double-walled boundary with deep blue staining at the cytoplasmic periphery. So these cells are particularly associated with pregnancy, as the name suggests. So again, let's compare the navicular cells and pregnancy cells. So because even though they are on the same phase, but they have different morphology. So to make it short, navicular, they are both shaped and they have folded edges. For pregnancy cell, they are glycogen filled center, and they have an eccentric nucleus, and they are double fold. Next, we have the parabasal cells. So they are smaller than intermediate cells. So they are thick and round to oval with a smaller but strongly basophilic cytoplasmic area and a larger vesicular nucleus relative to their size compared to intermediate cells. So these cells are normally found during specific phases of life in the first 2 weeks of life and through puberty, after childbirth, after abortions, and after menopause. So in adults, their presence in a smear reflects reduced estrogen stimulation. So as estrogen normally drives full maturation toward intermediate and superficial cells. So when estrogen is low, such as after menopause or postpartum, the epithelium regresses to producing more immature cell types like your parabasal cells. Next, we have your basal cells. So they are the most immature of the vaginal epithelial cell types. They are small, round to slightly oval cells with large nuclei that occupy more than half of the total cell volume. So a high nuclear to cytoplasmic ratio, their cytoplasm is strongly basophilic. So these cells are normally found only before puberty and after menopause. So when estrogen stimulation is at its lowest, so in the presence of estrogen, these cells mature and transform into the more differentiated cell types we have already discussed. So their presence in an adult reproductive age woman outside of expected low estrogen, and states should prompt further evaluation. So I hope that this mnemonic will help you. Again, basal, basically bare nucleus. Okay? So even let's compare your basal and your parabasal cells. So both are immature. No, they are also both found at low estrogen states or levels. But again, basal cells are smaller with an even larger nucleus to cytoplasm ratio. Next, we have the endometrial cells. So in a cervicovaginal smear, your endometrial cells resemble parabasal cells, but they are slightly cylindrical and less basophilic in their cytoplasm. So they are normally found during and 1 to 4 days after menstruation. So when the uterine lining is shedding, so their presence outside of this window, especially in postmenopausal women, can be clinically significant and many indicate endometrial pathology, so warranting further investigation. So cytologists must always note the timing of the menstrual cycle when interpreting cervicovaginal smears. Next, we have endocervical glandular cells. So they come from the columnar epithelium lining the endocervical canal. So on a smear, they typically occur in large groups or sheets with a characteristic honeycomb appearance. So the cells are arranged side by side with their boundaries visible, resembling a honeycomb when viewed from above. So their cytoplasm is finely vacuolated and pale blue to gray in color. So the vacuoles reflect their mucin secreting function. For the clinical significance, abnormal glandular cells found in a pap smear, sometimes called AGC or atypical glandular cells, may indicate cancer or other serious conditions. So finding them requires careful follow-up, including colposcopy and possibly endocervical curettage. Next, we have the Dodder-Lane bacilli. So it's also identified as Lactobacillus acidophilus. So these are the most common normal vaginal flora. So on pap stain, they appear blue to lavender in color. So an increased number of Dodder-Lane bacilli indicates a healthy vaginal environment. So these organisms maintain the acidic pH of the vagina, approximately 3.5 to 4.5, which suppresses the growth of pathogenic organisms. So they are numerous in specific situations. So during the last trimester of pregnancy, so when glycogen content of vaginal cells increase, providing substrate for lactobacilli. So during infections, during estrogen deficiency, and in diabetes mellitus. So where increased glucose provides more fermentable substrate. So when Dodder-Lane bacilli are decreased, there is a corresponding increase in the population of invasive Leptotrix species, and this is commonly accompanied by the presence of Trichomonas vaginalis, which is a flagellated protozoan that is a common cause of vaginal infection. The ferning phenomenon, so also known as arborization, it refers to the characteristic fern or palm leaf pattern formed by salt crystals when the cervical mucus is allowed to dry on a glass slide. So this pattern signifies persistent estrogen effect. So during the follicular phase, estrogen causes the cervical mucus to become thin, watery, and high in salt content. So ideal conditions for crystal formation when it dries. So clinically, the ferning phenomenon is used as a basis for diagnosing early pregnancy and for identifying the timing of ovulation. So the pattern disappears in the luteal phase under progesterone influence. So as progesterone makes the mucus thick and viscous, preventing burning. So I have here visuals of the positive result for burning phenomenon. So as you can see, it resembles a palm leaf. So next, how do we recognize a normal pregnancy based on cytologic findings? There are 4 criteria that must be met for a cytologic diagnosis of normal pregnancy. First, marked progesterone effect. reflecting the dominant hormonal milieu of pregnancy. Second, at least 50% of intermediate cells should be in clusters. Group cells are a characteristic finding in progesterone-dominated smears. So third, at least some typical pregnancy cells must be present. So the round cells with central glycogen accumulation and eccentric nuclei that we discussed earlier. Fourth, less than 30% of mature superficial cells because high progesterone suppresses full maturation. So fifth, a Doderlin field dirty background. So the smear background should show numerous lactobacilli and cellular debris. So reflecting the high glycogen content of the vaginal epithelium in pregnancy. Vaginal cytology can be evaluated quantitatively using three main indices. First, the maturation index or the MI. This is the percentage of cells from the main layers of vaginal epithelium. So the superficial layer, the intermediate layer, and the deep or the basal parabasal layer. So it is reported as three numbers that add up to 100. So for example, so we have 10/70/20. It means that there are 10% superficial, 70% intermediate, and 20% deep. So the criterion for classification is pycnosis. So cells with pycnotic nuclei are counted as superficial. Those with open vesicular nuclei are intermediate or deep. So the MI is the most comprehensive of the three indices. Second, the acidophilic index or the AI. This is the percentage of cells staining pink, orange to red on the pap smear. However, this index has a significant limitation. It is not reliable because of the possibility of pseudoacidophilia, so which we discussed earlier. So a cell may stain pink not because of true keratinization but due to drying artifacts or infection. So third, the pycnotic index or the PI. So this is the percentage of the cells with shrunken, dark, and structureless nuclei. So the hallmark of a pycnotic nucleus. So unlike the AI, the PI focuses on nuclear morphology rather than cytoplasmic color, so making it a more reliable indicator of cell maturity. Again, we have MI, AI, and PI. So the contrast between AI and PI, AI is unreliable due to pseudoacidophilia, and your PI is more reliable and it is a frequently tested distinction. So the reporting of cervical cytologic smears has historically followed the Papanicolaou classification system, which uses Roman numerals from class 1 to class 5. For class 1, we have absence of atypical or abnormal cells. This is a completely normal smear. For class 2, atypical cytologic picture but no evidence of malignancy. There are some abnormal cells present, so perhaps due to inflammation or reactive changes, but they do not suggest cancer. For class 3, the cytologic picture is suggestive but not conclusive of malignancy. This is an equivocal result. So there are suspicious cells, but the findings are insufficient to make a definitive diagnosis, so these patients need further evaluation. For class 4, cytologic picture is strongly suggestive of malignancy. So the cells have many features of cancer, but the diagnosis has not yet been confirmed histologically. So class 5, cytologic picture conclusive of malignancy. The cells are unequivocally malignant. So please note that while the Papanicolaou classes are still referenced, modern laboratories now often use the Bethesda system, which provides more specific and clinically actionable terminology. So however, for this lesson, the Papanicolaou classification is the framework we use. Beyond the Papanicolaou stain, there are other microscopic techniques used in cytology. Let us discuss three of them. First, acridine orange fluorescent technique. Acridine orange is a fluorescent dye that intercalates into nucleic acids. So when it binds to DNA, it fluoresces green or yellow. An increased green-yellow fluorescence indicates an increase in DNA content, which is associated with malignancy. Malignant cells have more DNA than the normal cells. So when acridine orange binds to RNA, it fluoresces brick orange-red. Increased orange-red fluorescence indicates increased RNA synthesis, which is associated with rapid cellular growth. such as in regenerating tissue or early proliferative states. So second, we have the phase contrast microscopy. So this technique exploits differences in the refractive index of cellular structures to generate contrast without staining. So it is considered the second best choice after pap staining. It is used for hormonal evaluation of gynecologic specimens and for cancer detection. So the advantage is that it can be used on unstained living cells. Third, we have interference microscopy. This is a highly specialized technique that determines the dry weight of individual cells or cellular constituents by measuring optical path differences. So it provides quantitative information about cellular composition. However, it is very expensive and complex, so limiting its use to specialized research settings. And that concludes our lecture on exfoliative cytology. So today we cover the definitions of cytology and its subtypes, the purposes of exfoliative cytology, the preparation and processing of cytologic specimens, the various specimen types from both non-gynecologic and gynecologic sources, the Papa-Nicolau staining method and its components, the cell types seen in cervicovaginal smears, the hormonal indices, and the classification system for reporting cytologic findings. And here are our references for today's video. So please do review your notes and focus particularly on the different specimen types and their processing requirements, the PopStain components, the cell types, and their hormonal associations, and the Papa-Nicolau classification system. So thank you so much for listening and see you at our next session.